Please take your seats. I was worried that during the break we saw a mass migration to the coffee, and I didn't know if there was going to be a return, but there is. And so, you know, and thank God, because we are talking about return migration a lot these days. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute. It's a great delight to be here with this very distinguished panel of present and former scholars, fellows at the Wilson Center. We are going to follow exactly the same format as in the previous panel, in which we'll have very brief opening introductory comments from our panelists. Then we're going to move to a round of questions where we seek responses. And I'd love you all to prepare questions while you're listening to the words of wisdom that are spilling forth from this panel. The idea, as always, is to be as interactive as possible. So, you know, I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. Let me just make a couple of very, very brief comments about immigration and the conversations that I've been having recently with folks here and, of course, in Mexico. Hi, Lenny. It is, obviously, we've been through years of the politicization of the immigration debate. We're seeing the emergence of new conversations about immigration, about questions of human capital, about the new kind of immigrant that are coming in. And as somebody who has been an immigrant 3 times in my life already, in Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and legally in all 3, let me say, okay, before anybody says, well, documented. I don't know whether I was legal. I mean, you know, let's just use that term for now. I can say that it's been an enormously positive experience for me, but it's also a very daunting experience. This is somebody who, you know, I'm relatively well educated. I have a lot of support from my family, didn't come from a particularly poor background. And immigration is daunting. And, you know, a lot of my family members back home always say to me that, well, you're the one that left home. And they say it somewhat begrudgingly sometimes. But they also say that this is, you know, a sign that you're willing to take risks and to go out there into the world and to find new opportunities. And that's great. But then I look at what immigrants do from so many other countries, not just here in the United States, but around the world. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. And this obviously carries great implications both for the United States and its relationship with the world. Without any further ado, I would like to turn the microphone over to Edward Schumacher. I'm not going to read out any bios here. You have them in front of you. It's suffice it to say that these are alumni of the Wilson Center and friends of the Wilson Center. Edward is going to make some opening comments about the future demographics and the current demographics of the United States, and then we're going to move down the line. We're going to have a very varied conversation to begin with, and I'm going to try and pull it all together. So, Edward, please take it away.
Thank you, Duncan. I actually was illegal here as an immigrant, so it was a technicality, but little did I realize I've been living here legally for years and was invited to leave the country and had to join the Army as a way to stay. No, it's a great delight to meet so many alums coming back for this event, and it was wonderful to see the question that was asked at the last panel. Because it does reflect a lot of what is the concern, right? That this current wave of immigration that we're in the midst of is undermining our political creed. You know, that all these immigrants are going to take our jobs, drain our resources. They're bringing crime. They're mongrelizing the race. They're threatening our language. They're threatening our very unity and identity as a nation. Well, you know, we're so far into this current wave of mass migration that now we can begin to say some definite things about where we're going as a country and what does it mean for this precise question of this half day here about the American future. And that is really, if you look at the statistics, and I'd like to just lay out the demographics, if I might, and let my colleagues sort of begin picking up the analysis of some of it, is that just as in the past, immigration, this current wave of immigration is re-energizing the nation. It's really contributing to the nation being more indispensable, not less. That the immigrants who are coming have the same kind of tolerance for risk, the belief in hard work, the faith in the future that we all think of when we think of the Ellis Island generation and past waves of immigration to come to this country. And let me say that the project I'm working here on at Wilson is precisely going back, my co-author and I have an exclusive database that tracks every immigrant who came through Ellis Island, 28 million, their children and their grandchildren by name, about what they did and what they accomplished here, and what education they received, what businesses they started, what patents they filed for, and everything like that. And we're going to use that as a baseline to compare to today to measure the economic impact of mass migration, and specifically on entrepreneurship, innovation, and American economic power. If anybody has money they'd like to contribute or knows who wants to, so we can finish the study, we'd greatly appreciate it. But let's really look at what we have, demographically today. We've got more or less 42 million immigrants and another 37 million children of those immigrants who were born here, right? At current trends, 2/3 of the population growth and 90% of the increase in the working age population between now and 2050. 90% of the increase in the working age population will be immigrants and their children. In other words, by 2050, more or less, right, some 37% of the population will be immigrants and their children. That's higher than at any time in American history. During the Ellis Island era, it got to 35%. About half of these immigrants since 1965 have come from Latin America, and about a quarter from Asia. What few people realize is that since 2009, more Asians have been coming to the country than Latin Americans. I mean, we always think, it's Latin Americans, right? But now it's really more Asians coming. In 1960, the country was 85% white. By 2060, it'll be 43% white. It's a different looking country, without a doubt. Will all these new immigrants have that same sense of upward mobility that we like to think of as the American dream and so forth? Particularly when about a quarter of these immigrants today are illegal, which kind of hinders their advancement, needless to say. Will they be able, we can say that this is a different era from the Ellis Island era, that globalization means that different skills are needed, different kind of jobs, different kind of skills. They're really going to tie us down more. Can we say that because of globalization it works against the integration of immigrants? They're still tied to their homeland because of instant communication, because they can go back home so much more easily? Well, again, looking at the data today, so far the concerns are misplaced, and the message is overwhelmingly positive. Does not say that there aren't problems. Hispanic, second generation adults have a median household income today of $48,000 a year. The overall median household income for Americans is $58,000. Yes, it's less, but $48,000 is not bad, and it's closing fast. One reason is because it's a much younger demographic than the overall American. So they still have many more years to close in on that 58,000. Half of Hispanic second generation adults own their own home already. Half, right? 52%, a little bit more than half, have some college. And they have a median income, the median age is only 28 years old, right? Culturally, they're in the U.S. mainstream. Almost all of them speak English and speak it well. Many of them speak Spanish. They claim to speak it. They don't speak it perfectly, but they try to hang on to it. They identify as Americans, but they identify as hyphenated Americans. And you might say, well, wait a minute, what's this hyphenation thing? Well, the truth is, most millennials identify as hyphenated Americans. It's where we've come as a country. We're no longer a melting pot nation. We're really much more a mosaic nation, in which each individual piece has a certain identity, but we're still part of the same whole. It's a different way of looking at the nation, but there's still a strong sense of being American. Indeed, and what we often think of as American values, they hold stronger than longtime Americans, than those of you, I should say, I said those of us because I feel American, right? Than those of us who've been here for generations. 78% of the first and second generations say that the way to get ahead is hard work, right? The work ethic. Among Americans overall, only 58% say that. In other words, they believe in hard work more than most Americans do. They have conservative family values. They're religious strivers. They really embody the American creed. the fears, the questions raised by Sam Huntington were the right questions to raise. He just reached the wrong answers, right? It's not to say that it's all good. There's a deficit of social trust, among Hispanics. They don't really trust people as much as ordinary Americans. There's a high school dropout rate. But it keeps coming down. As 1 in 3 Hispanics were dropping out of high school in 2000. It's now 1 in 5, right? They're behind in reading and math. But their high school graduation rate, they're now more likely than whites to enroll in college, even though it's a junior college. The Asian Americans, I know you're going to talk about Asian Americans, I won't say much about it. But the Asian Americans, before 1952, they couldn't even get citizenship here as an immigrant. Mm-hmm. But today, it's the highest income, best educated, fastest growing racial group in America. They're more satisfied with their lives, their finances, and the direction of the country than any other group in the country, including longstanding Americans. They place more value on parenthood, hard work, marriage, and career success than any group. Polls after polls show these kinds of things. Overwhelmingly, it's a first-generation group. Some 60% have come only in recent years, but they come with college degrees. Most get green cards to their employers, unlike Hispanics who come through family reunification. So let me just end in with one last little thing as we looked at sort of and undocumented kind of fit in the same thing with the rest of Hispanics. But one last thing I want to add about foreign policy and about what does it mean for America's place in the world. When you have so many Chinese and Indians and Latin Americans do so well here, what does that mean for our relationships with China and India going forward in the future? Something for all of us to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Fantastic. And it's almost as if we planned this panel because you seem to have segued perfectly into Karthik's presentation. So please, Karthik, your comments.
Thank you. And yeah, that's a perfect setup. First of all, thanks to the Wilson Center for giving me a break and being a fellow, and now for nominating me as a global fellow. I feel the Wilson Center hug very strongly. And huh? It's an intellectual hug.
No touching.
No touching. Right. I'll also say I'm thinking a lot about immigration policy in my own work, but I'm the Associate Dean of the brand new School of Public Policy at UCR, and immigration is among the things we care about. On some of these things, I'll just the benefit of going later is you can start reacting a little bit to what came earlier. There's a National Academy of Sciences panel going on right now to look at both the fiscal and social integration impacts. I'm on that along with a bunch of other colleagues, and we should have our report out in the fall, treading on many of these questions. And it's important. The last time the National Academies did a study of this was 20 years ago, and it was mostly focused on the fiscal effects. And this panel, this time we actually have 2 separate reports, and the one I'm involved in is looking at the social and political consequences. And the story is largely a positive one, exactly as the way you laid it out. 2 things I want to say that relate to work that I'm doing that I think could help. One is on Asian migration. And I love the different analogies and that people were using in the last panel, so I'm going to go with that, which is to invoke Wayne Gretzky, right? And the way, and you see this in the way the immigration debate is happening in Washington and even in media, which is so much of the way we talk about immigration. So Wayne Gretzky said, they asked him why he was so successful, and he says, I don't look at where the puck is, but where it will be, right? But it seems like our immigration debate is actually looking at where the puck was, right? Which is focused on Mexican migration, which I know there's a strong and vibrant Mexican program here, but that's not where most of the current migration is coming from. And when I've said this to people, in fact, I said it to a panel of eminent journalists in immigration to say, can you start covering immigration the way it is, as opposed to the way the politicians talk about it? And I have not seen much of a change in news coverage in the last few years, even though we've had this crossover point about, I guess, 6 years ago now, right? So why is that? I mean, to me, I don't want to necessarily say it's a failure of public intellectuals, but it's really frustrating to see that our debate is very narrow. right? You have the Senate bill that is probably one of the largest bills that was being considered a couple of years ago, and yet most of the debate centers on one very narrow segment, which is what to do with the unauthorized population. It's important. It's a very important issue. But there was so much else that was part of that Senate bill that did not get much attention, with very significant implications of what the future of migration will be. Already we've had this crossover point with more migration coming from Asia than from Latin America. With the kind of skills, beefing up of the skills provisions that the Senate bill had, you had groups like the Urban Institute coming up with some of these estimates that the country origin mix would have looked different with countries like India, the Philippines, and China growing even larger in terms of their share of the population. So that's something that I think is a challenge as we look ahead to immigration. The other thing is when we think ahead to immigration, it's not just about the demographics, but also policies. And on this, I'll make a plug for a book that's coming out that I started here when I was at the Wilson Center. Cambridge Press is going to be putting it out in September, and it's called The New Immigration Federalism. And there, what that book shows, there's a kind of historical sweep, but then it kind of focuses in on the post-9/11 period. Essentially, in the first decade or so after 9/11, there were a lot of restrictive laws being proposed. Even if there were places that didn't have many immigrants, there was a kind of immigration fever, especially among conservatives in the Republican Party in various states that pushed these efforts. A lot of them caught fire, ironically, during a time of economic boom, which we don't expect in terms of restrictive opinion and action. But many of them got halted by the courts. And 2012 is a significant turning point. The U.S. Supreme Court weighs in on many of these state enforcement provisions and limits the authority of states when it comes to enforcement. But there are some restrictive measures, including mandating E-Verify, that the Congress had allowed. Now, whether it was explicit or not is open to debate, but in 1986, they did allow states to control licenses of businesses. And so those restrictive efforts are still there. But what we've really seen, though, since 2012 is a shifting of the tide towards more pro-integration legislation. Many more states now offer driver licenses, first of all, to DACA recipients. Almost every state offers it, but then to other undocumented immigrants. In-state tuition. Now we're talking about expansion of health benefits. If you look at what California is doing, California is really kind of pushing the envelope in terms of what states can do. You can practice, you can be a member of the California bar and be undocumented. Starting in 2016, all professional licensing boards in California have to justify why they would exclude undocumented immigrants, right? I have a policy brief coming out with my grad student that talks about this as a de facto state citizenship. One that's not necessarily in conflict with federal citizenship, but operates in parallel. But it's not quite the same as non-citizens voting in the Midwest in the 1800s, but it's really going there. And the thing that I would venture to guess or bet, if I had to bet some money, is that even if you have comprehensive immigration reform, what states like California are doing go beyond that. Because what comprehensive immigration reform does is actually increase the kind of penalties and enforcements and the dividing line, right, between documented and undocumented. And what California is doing is blurring that line. And the way they're doing it is, interestingly, not from a civil rights framework, but from a workforce development framework, to say that we need to harness all that we can from our workforce. So you have people that get in-state tuition, get advanced college degrees and advanced degrees, and what are you going to do with them, right? They have to be able to practice their professions. And I think you're going to see more and more states that are going to have to come to terms with that, because chances are, at least until 2020, there's probably not going to be comprehensive immigration reform. And I can say more later about why 2020.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And ahead of time. Great. Incredible. When you were making your comments on about Wayne Gretzky, I thought, maybe we need to change that now to Lionel Messi, maybe. And of course, in the future, thinking ahead, as Wayne Gretzky would, maybe it's going to have to be Sachin Tendulkar or something like that, a cricketer who will actually give us his
One can always dream
of
cricket catching fire here.
It may be a lot of people's worst nightmare.
Right.
But We're going to change tack a little bit here. We're delighted to have with us Susan Terrio, who, very happy days for you. Your book is about to come out.
It came out.
It's
out.
come out. We're here to celebrate that.
Thank you.
You know, you spent a good amount of time here working on the book as a fellow. We're delighted to have you back, so please take it away.
Thank you very much. Yes, it is a pleasure. And I was a fellow in 2012, 2013. And I was working on the federal custodial system for unaccompanied, undocumented minors. And very little is actually known about that system. So the book centers on the challenges of that system. And I just want to talk a little bit about that system because the rationale for the creation of a special system in 1997 was precisely to ensure humane detention standards for a very vulnerable population and to prevent abuse and exploitation. And as a result of my access to closed facilities, as well as federal foster care programs, observation of immigration court proceedings, and following a large number of kids who had been detained, were released, and had legal status, I came to a number of conclusions about the challenges that system continues to pose, particularly after the surge that we saw last summer. And what I concluded in the book was the system is an expanding bureaucratic leviathan. In 2014, the number of kids in custody ballooned to 61,000, in excess of 61,000. And when I started doing my research in 2008, there were 39 closed facilities. That number had ballooned to 110 last year. So it's a costly, cumbersome, and very complicated system that exhibits a pronounced tension between dedication to humanitarian issues and protection and one that's actually much more focused on enforcement. In fact, few people know that there are two immediate consequences when kids are designated as unaccompanied, that is, in the country without an adult to provide care and custody, and under 18 and undocumented, so that they are immediately diverted to a special detention system, mandatory detention, and then also put into removal proceedings in immigration court. So on the one hand, the federal government assigns itself as a legal guardian, making all the decisions about custody, the type and length of custody, including release, and on the other hand, it prosecutes these kids for unlawful presence in the country. And within days of their apprehension and placement in custody, they're taken to immigration courts, where they appear before an immigration judge and opposite a powerful government prosecutor without legal representation. Why? Because they have no right to appointed legal representation. And we know the importance of having legal representation in immigration court. The track at Syracuse University has come up with statistics regularly, but last year showed that only 32% of the 62,000 cases of unaccompanied kids that were pending in immigration courts were represented. But when kids do have representation, 73% of those cases have a favorable outcome, compared with only 12% when kids are without representation. The other major obstacle that we have to be aware of are the few viable options under U.S. immigration law for unaccompanied children, kids who are under 18. They can apply for asylum, but to do so, they have to present, they should have legal representation. They have to present an individualized case and prove persecution based on one of the 5 protected grounds. And children are not a protected class. And increasingly, federal judges, immigration judges, have been discouraged from granting asylum based on non-persecution from non-state actors, such as the gangs and cartels that we know are operating. Another form of immigration relief is special immigrant juvenile visas, but those are very complicated too, because it requires that a kid become certified in a family or state court in the U.S. And another challenge in response to the 2014 surge was that the Office of Executive Review that runs the immigration courts actually instituted expedited hearings for kids who are in removal proceedings, which made it all the more difficult to legally screen them for potential legal relief, as well as to obtain legal representation. And what I want to point out as well, not only do we need more immigration judges, but we need attorneys to be appointed for children, as well as child advocates. Advantages that they would have in a domestic court. But international as well as domestic norms in child welfare practice stipulate that detention should be a last resort, not a first response. And in addition, what the government has done in response to the surge is to create more and more large-scale facilities. And what we know from research is that those are the least appropriate facilities in which children should be detained. And there has been considerable debate about the least restrictive setting, which is what federal law stipulates now for children who are held in federal custody. But I would argue, and I have argued in the book, that when children are put into closed facilities where there is monitored entry, exit, and movement within premises, where there is 24-hour surveillance, where there are line-of-sight checks, it's really hard to argue that that doesn't constitute detention or a form of incarceration. There need to be more alternatives to institutionalized settings, and indeed there are a few more alternatives, such as group homes and independent living arrangements. But as I said, in response to the surge and the increased numbers of kids coming across, what the government has done is create large-scale facilities that have in excess of 100 kids. And in addition, we've seen the model of family detention, which was essentially stopped in 2009 as a result of litigation and advocacy when the Hutto facility in Taylor, Texas was closed. That has reemerged, again, as a result of the surge. And the government has turned once again to for-profit prison corporations such as the Correction Corporation of America and GEO to build 2 very large-scale facilities in Texas and to double the capacity of the Berks County Detention Center in Pennsylvania. Those are disturbing. From my own research and from research that has been done by a number of academics, anthropologists, sociologists, and others, we know that the effect of detention is negative on children, even when it's a relatively short period of detention. The kids that I saw and actually interviewed experienced increased anxiety due to the separation from their families, many of whom had families in this country, their uncertainty about their legal status, their fear of deportation, and the fact that most people don't know, immigration detention has no set endpoint, unlike penal conviction. I think because we're talking about the Mexico incident here, the other thing that we've been very concerned about is since 2011, we've seen increasing numbers of Mexican children and youth who are crossing the border. And the vast majority, as many of you know who follow what happens to Mexican kids, they are returned within a 72-hour period in violation of the protections that were instituted in the TVPRA of 2008. While Central American kids were supposed to be screened adequately, so were Mexican kids. Unfortunately, the federal government assigned those screening responsibilities to the enforcement branches of the government, the CBP and ICE. While they may be well-intentioned, they have not been adequately trained to screen kids for fear of persecution. And so the result has been a revolving door that was meant to be stopped in 2008 and has continued, the vast majority being returned within a very short period. And I just want to emphasize something that hasn't been reported widely in the media. In March of this year, we organized a briefing at Georgetown with immigration attorneys, caseworkers who work with these kids on the ground, and academics like me. They reported that repeated border crossers, and we know that much of the migration was forced migration last summer in particular. So kids who are returned are in a position or feel compelled to try and cross the border again, many from Mexico. And as a result of those repeated border crossings, we saw that one of the responses was to place those kids in high security facilities as a punishment and deterrence technique. And we've also seen that interdiction efforts have been assumed, have been transferred basically from the US to Mexico, and that Mexico deports more than 85% of the Central American migrants, so that what we've seen is the militarization of the border between Mexico and Guatemala. And it was interesting, many of you may have heard the Diane Rehm show on Wednesday that was devoted to unaccompanied minors. And the Mexican ambassador spoke about the 2011 Mexican law that required undocumented migrants be handled in a humanitarian way. And what many advocates and people who have been on the ground have said is, in fact, that law has not been implemented adequately, that the shelters that young people are held in are not adequate for children under 18, and that much more attention needs to be paid to humanitarian issues.
Susan, can I ask you to wrap up the opening comments right now?
Sure.
Thank you.
I would just say that the challenges of having a system that relies on detention have to be revisited. We have to explore alternatives to detention. We have to adequately screen kids, but we also have to revisit this automatic detention system.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. You overshot the time a little bit, but your timing is perfect in so many ways. I mean, you were working on this book last year when the crisis, entre comillas, it really hit.
Right, exactly.
And now you're releasing the book, not just in time for this year's crisis, but also, of course, for this event. We really appreciate the way that you managed to make that happen. I am delighted to have with us a dear friend of the Mexico Institute, Jonathan Fox, who's been working with us for so many years. A number of years ago, worked on a project on migrant communities here in the United States. Jonathan, you are one of the keenest observers of this phenomenon over the years, and so we'll be very happy to hear your comments right now.
Thank you, Duncan, and thanks to the Wilson Center for having me back. This invitation led me to think a bit more reflectively about the relationship between my time here and what I ended up doing afterwards. And it being here, this is 0405, helped me to see gaps that had not been so clear to me before, particularly the gaps in the policy discussion and the scholarly energy being dedicated to understand and deal with the process of immigrant integration in the United States. Opening the New York Times this morning, I was struck by an op-ed with a very creative proposal about repopulating Detroit by resettling Syrian refugees. Already have a huge Arab community there. And when was the last time you saw an op-ed in the New York Times or the Washington Post about immigrant integration? The Metro pages of both newspapers do a fantastic job of covering many dimensions of immigrant integration, but it's a topic that is segregated often to the subnational level, because at the national level immigration is quickly reduced to the question of what to do with the undocumented, leaving out those who have become citizens and legal permanent residents. And so that's really going to be my main proposition for the opening remarks, which is that the mainstream national policy debate and the vast majority of scholars essentially take immigrant integration for granted. And that's, when we're talking about, what are we up to, 13% foreign-born in the US right now? That's kind of a big problem. I mean, Carthag's a remarkable exception in terms of focusing from a more political science point of view on immigrant integration, and it's really an issue that led me to spend the next several years focusing a lot on this, with 5 years of intense partnership with the Mexico Institute, looking at the dynamics specifically of Mexican immigrant civic engagement in the United States, and it involved extensive collaboration between researchers and practitioners, not only here in Washington, but in 9 U.S. cities. So the Wilson Center was leaving Washington, figuratively, with forums and reader-friendly research reports in Charlotte and Fresno and Omaha and Chicago and San Jose, and it was quite I think a dynamic process that I think a lot of us learned a lot from. And one of the takeaways is the extraordinary variation in the patterns of civic engagement over time and across cities and states. We have some moments and sectors of what one could call extreme civicness. We have the immigrant rights protests of 2006, which led to some of the largest protests around any issue of any kind in many of the largest cities of the United States, particularly in the Sun Belt. We also have more than 600,000 dreamers who have successfully navigated the bureaucracy and gotten semi-regularized. And a bit against the current of this issue of social trust, what could be more trusting than giving all of your personal information to the federal government as an undocumented young person? So we have extreme civicness, and then we have vast regions of the United States where immigrants, and I'm talking particularly documented immigrants, who are dramatically underrepresented, and This is coming from years of work with partners in the Central Valley of California, where we have dramatically low rates of naturalization of eligible permanent residents, as well as voter turnout for second-generation immigrant youth. The high schools are really not doing their job in terms of teaching civic engagement, particularly important for kids, for all kids, but for kids from immigrant families in particular. This is an issue in California. Half of the 18-year-olds are Latino. And so when you look at youth voter turnout rates, which are in a way easier to measure than Latino turnout rates because of the way the data is organized, 2012 elections for young adult citizens 18 to 24, only 32% turned out. Not only in an election where a presidential election, but also there were ballot initiatives that were going to determine whether or not the public education was going to continue to go down the path of what is sometimes called Mississippification, public education in California, and essentially there was a huge abstention, and with a range of variation from county to county that meant that in some particularly high immigrant counties, 17% of young adult citizens voting in a presidential election. This is a big deal and leads to essentially a system of minority rule in large parts of California. And when we look at the issues of naturalization, we see also similar extreme patterns of variation from both state to state and county to county. If we're looking at what are the percentages of eligible Mexican permanent residents who become citizens. In the early research with the Mexico Institute, we found the variation from state to state by a factor of 2. So double Illinois would have double the rate of Mexican citizenship compared to Texas or New Mexico. And then drilling deeper within California, we also found a variation by a factor of 2. So Mexicans in Los Angeles were twice as likely to become citizens as in Fresno. And so we saw important improvements from 2004 to 2010, the most recent data that we've been able to get. That meant that the rate of citizenship for eligible Mexicans went from about 28% in 2004 to 36% in 2010. The absolute numbers at the same time kept growing. And so there are still 1.5 million potential citizens of Mexican origin in California in 2010. That's out of the 8 million plus permanent residents nationally who are eligible for citizenship right now. Actually, this is old data because the federal government is not actually just disseminating the data that we would need to have a more informed debate. This is back in 2012, but that's a lot of potential citizens who are not currently part of the electorate. And one of the examples of the lopsidedness in the debate is that when we were following the comprehensive immigration reform debate that Karthik mentioned, there was a lot of debate and polarization around whether or not there was going to be a path to citizenship, but there wasn't much discussion of how people would actually navigate that path. Where were they going to get access to the free English classes after work and the reliable legal advice and the citizenship classes, hopefully in their native language, that would be required to navigate what was a very long and torturous path in the best case scenario to citizenship. So essentially the permanent residents have been crowded out of the debate around immigration in the United States. So I just want to mention historically this was not always the case. After the 1986 Ronald Reagan amnesty, remember Ronald Reagan amnesty for immigrants, the federal government put $4 billion, according to a little article by Doris Meissner, $4 billion into supporting people's capacity to work their way through the system and come out the other end either with their green card or eventually as citizens. This was back in the late 80s, early 90s. And so my final point is basically I think we need to treat immigrant integration as a public good. And that means that it requires, like other public goods, a significant investment of public resources and also much more scholarly energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was terrific. A lot of issues that have been put on the table here, and I'd like to try to pull everything together to talk a little bit about how the United States perceives its own immigration culture, its own business of immigration, how the US government has a vision or not of immigration into the future. I spent a lot of time in my life in Canada. Canada has a very different approach to immigration. They are strategic in the sense of saying we have certain labor market necessities in this country, and although we don't choose nationalities, what we do is we close and we open consulates, we offer more visas in certain places, we make it easier to get a visa in certain places than in others. And that is a way of thinking about their economy and immigration, which is very, very different than the United States. The United States has a traditional family reunification as the driving force for immigration. I'd really like to hear the panel's responses to that, to say, is a model like Canada's a fairer, better, more effective way to run your immigration system? Or are we actually on the right path in the United States? Karthik, you put your hand up first. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. And I'll disclose that my wife is Canadian, and we debate at times. Canadians think that they have it all down, right? And I've spent some time in Canada myself on my way to the United States. And I would argue that, in many ways, yes, Canada might have a kind of it does have a more rational immigration policy, but does it have a more humanitarian immigration policy? And I think that's an important question to be asking. We saw elements of that in the Senate bill. And one of the things that wasn't talked about as much is so much of the way the Senate bill imagined the strategic value of immigration was in some ways moving away, and here we are at the 50th anniversary of the Immigration and Nationality Act that put those bedrock principles of family reunification and skills both as core values. Many of these advocacy organizations, and many of them Asian Americans actually, were pushing back against this greater tilt towards skills and removing some of the other kind of family clauses, right? Not the spouses and minor children, but some of the other family provisions that would have been taken out by that bill. And that's important to keep in mind, I think, when we think about the optimal mix that we should have. So I think that, and I would also say that one of the other cautions, so first of all, we are not like Canada, so in the sense that first, even getting some basic elements of reform is a heavy lift. But will Congress give up its ability to control the kinds of caps on different types of visas? I'm not sure that they would. In Canada, it's a more bureaucratic process that's determined, and it's quite flexible. Finally, I'll say another major problem that we have is the country limits, right? So 1965 did away with country barriers or quotas, but there still are these country limits which really affect migration from Mexico, the Philippines, and a few other Asian countries. And that's one of the things that should be talked about in any kind of reform. Why would you constrain it? You might want to say, okay, we don't want as many family visa provisions, but why would you put country caps on it? And that's, I think, an important thing to think about as we think about reforming our immigration system.
Edward, I mean, I know that you've thought about this issue. The question of picking winners, governments are famously bad at it, whether it's picking industrial winners or picking winners in any area of society. From what you've seen in terms of your demographic approach that you've presented here, is the system working in favor of the United States? I mean, the data that you laid out here, that the immigrants that come to the country believe that hard work is the way forward. I mean, it seems to be working, doesn't it, in that sense, for the good of the nation, or is there a better way to do it?
I mean, clearly, for the best of the nation would be a skills-driven type of immigration system like Canada and Australia have, Germany has, many of the European countries. The study that the National Research Council did back in the 90s, and I'm waiting to see the one you're working on now, shows that the fiscal costs for immigrants who arrive with less than a high school degree are significant. And in fact, that the country pays more in services for those immigrants and their children and even their grandchildren than it receives in taxes. Whereas when a college-educated immigrant arrives, the country fiscally benefits from day one and didn't have to educate them. So So yeah, if you look at it in just cold, hard terms like that, clearly we'd be best if everybody who arrived had a college degree, especially if they had in the STEM field, right? That said, do you have a humanitarian kind of a obligation? Is it good to reflect the world? Is it good to have a mix of people from lots of different countries, both for our foreign policy and our sense of who we are as a nation, creating what we are? Our history certainly was not built on importing skills. So it doesn't condemn you to suddenly becoming a third world country because you have people coming in through their family reunification. Yes, it takes you at least one generation, shall we say, to begin to get them up. And so sort of some of the figures I showed that they do successfully help drive American economic growth and vitality and power and the whole vitality of the whole system of the United States. So those are kind of the trade-offs. There is no one good answer.
We've just been through general elections in Britain, and of course immigration was one of the big issues there. And during the lead up to, we saw the rise of UKIP as a party, sort of very much an anti-immigrant party. And there were a lot of figures being thrown around during the election campaign about the costs that immigrants impose upon a society, in terms of social services, etc. And people came up with these enormous figures. And then somebody worked out that, in fact, if you calculated the cost of immigrants versus the cost of UK citizens over the past decade, UK citizens per person had cost a lot more because of unemployment rate. And then they worked out the contributions of the immigrants versus the contributions of UK citizens.
Can I just insert one
Please.
thing into this? And I think it's important to kind of expand the way we think about this. When we think about a new child that is being born, do we think, wow, how expensive is it going to be? And maybe we should not have any children. And in fact, if you look at what Japan and Germany, the situation they find themselves in is precisely you do not grow economies by limiting the kind of labor force that you want to have. Of course, it's expensive in the short term. In fact, I would say a native-born child is probably the most expensive person. But we
Certainly for me. Mine cost me a fortune.
But this is something that so we actually have some aspects of this immigration system right. And one other thing I would say we need to rethink is that high skills are the only skills that matter.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of industries that depend on different types of skills. So I think we actually need to think about what are the right skills for the kinds of jobs that we have, as opposed to, of course, if we had an immigration policy of only engineers coming in here, yes, in some sense it's a no-brainer, but that would be a disastrous immigration policy.
Susan.
I'd just like to expand the conversation around the economic costs and think about human capital. And I'm thinking about a study that was just quoted in the New York Times at the end of April about the costs of the negative impact on the children of unauthorized parents. And this is, sort of looking at skills, but looking at sort of prioritizing the human capital that we have already resident in kids who have gone through American public schools, who have been educated in our best universities, and still don't have legal status. But this is a study by Roberto Suro and Marcelo Suarez Orozco, and they synthesized a number of academic studies that show the deleterious effects on kids who are afraid that their parents will be documented, in terms of their educational attainment, their cognitive development, and their emotional stability. So yes, skills are important, but thinking about the cost and benefit of human capital that we have already in this country, I think that has to be something that's central to the conversation.
Thank you. Jonathan.
On the question of the fiscal costs of people without high school degrees, there are 2 points. One is I'm not sure that takes into account all the money they're putting into Social Security that is not well tracked. It's essentially helping to keep that afloat. And also, there's been a wave of recent research that tries to predict what would happen to the incomes of the currently undocumented if they were regularized, and that would have a dramatic effect on their earning power and their tax paying. So just looking at sort of starting point education in the absence of whether or not they're legitimate participants in the labor market is a bit is partial. I think the experience of Britain in the election raises another issue that relates to immigrant underrepresentation in our political system. One of the striking things about the British elections is how an extremely modest shift in the actual vote share of each party, 1 point one way, 1.5 point the other way in terms of Labour and Conservatives, leads to this dramatic shift in who actually has power. And that's really part of a first past the post system, which of course we share here, exaggerated with another layer of the Electoral College. What that means is if you have a geographic unevenness in terms of where immigrant voters live, and you have a first past the post system, you have the risk of extreme lopsidedness and unevenness in terms of whether or not they actually have a voice in the political system. So it's an issue for Latino voters, for example, that something like 3/4 of them live in only 5 states, only one of which is a swing state, and therefore their votes essentially are not competed for in presidential elections. Just to begin what could be a long conversation about the way our institutions constrain voice.
Without wanting to go into gerrymandering or drawing bizarre electoral districts.
Without even going there, yes.
Absolutely. All right. Susan raised a very, very interesting issue that I'd like to put to the panel, and then I'd like to receive some questions from the audience because we have about half an hour left in the session. Susan talked about the response from the Mexican government to conversations, let's say, with the US government about stopping the flow further south. Recently, some colleagues and I, both from the Wilson Center and from Mexican institutions, went down to Mexico's southern border, and we tried to get an understanding of how the issue is being handled there. We visited it's not a detention facility, it's a migration station, okay? And we were able to go in and to see the facilities, the procedures, etc. In many ways, they're very impressive because they're very well organized. But there certainly is a new desire to try to deal with the issue, at least in part, down in southern Mexico, to prevent it from coming up into northern Mexico, and therefore to relieve some of the pressure on the northern border.
Right.
It's been criticized heavily in Mexico, been criticized here in the United States. The broader issue, though, I think, is how do governments actually cooperate internationally to deal and address with the question of immigration, so that it does end up as much more of a positive-sum game?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that the root causes of migration, the forced migration, the gang and cartel violence, absolutely have to be addressed at the source. But the larger issue is the lack of sort of infrastructure, the sort of the weak institutions, the endemic corruption, and the lack of child welfare, really in place child welfare institutions, and I think there has been a lot of breakdown in inter-country cooperation, and a sort of a defense of sort of national priorities and a defensiveness about the appropriate approach, and a sort of resistance to American priorities and the Yankee sort of forced hand.
I think from the point of view maybe of Asian countries that experience a population decline, how do they see this phenomenon?
Well, I was going to go in a slightly different direction when you mentioned Asian countries. I mean, one thing I think if you look at international cooperation on security matters, even on that it's challenging, but I think they're getting better at it, right? Especially in terms of international terrorism, no-fly lists, and all these things. But I think going beyond that just gets so incredibly expensive. There's so many people that visit the United States, right? And to just kind of handle on that from a security perspective is one thing. But to try to manage migration remotely, which is what you're talking about, I mean, you do that when you come from Canada to the US, when you're flying in, right? You meet US Customs and Border Enforcement in Toronto, in Vancouver, et cetera. It's so incredibly expensive to install that in so many other countries, right? But the US did do that historically. If you look, in fact, at the start of our national immigration enforcement framework, it is with Chinese exclusion, right? So with the Page Act, station people in Asia make sure that undesirables don't board those ships to come to the US. I think it'd be incredibly expensive to do. I don't see that as viable. So at that point, then I think there could be particular countries. I don't know if the US and China will agree on many things, including some kind of exit control. But I think that it's unlikely to happen anytime soon.
And of course, you see the response or the role that the private sector plays in terms of enganchadores, recruiters who travel throughout the region to try to find the human capital that's needed there. And that's another interesting dimension that we really don't focus on very much in the academic sector, is what role does the private industry play in bringing people to the country. I'd like to open it up for questions here. We have one. I'd like to take three if we have 3 volunteers. 1, 2, 3, and then I'll get a second round with you two here. Yes, please.
Elaine Havigan. I asked a question to the head of the Fairfax County, and I asked him if there is a refugee program here in Fairfax County, and if it's funded by the federal government, and it's not. So my question is, the high schools are overcrowded already here, and we have an impact of refugee children from the Central America. There is no refugee program. Which is creating a huge problem for the local communities. First of all, we don't know how to raise the revenue in Fairfax County. This year we have $8 million short for education. Projected budget for next year, we will be $100 million short. Now the superintendent, Dr. Garza, is talking about issuing this $300,000 bond to fund the education. So until the federal government step up and come with an idea how we are going to fix the infrastructure, which means that the kids who are coming and they are desperate, they are put in regular schools. And this creates a problem with the local communities. We really need to build schools for them where they get intensive English language skill first before they can go to math classes or history or civic classes. Bringing the interpreters to the classroom, to a regular school, doesn't help the situation. It creates a segregation between children who speak English and children who do not speak English and do not understand whether the translator gives them the right information or not. So is there, very quickly, anybody is trying to bring this to the federal government and see if they are going to somehow to create a program?
Thank you so much, Philippa. Let's take the 3 questions and then we'll answer them, sure, if you don't mind. Sorry, microphone down here, sorry, if you don't mind. Okay. To the gentleman there, and we'll come back to you, Philippa, for the 3rd question, okay?
Yes. I was wondering to what degree some of the issues mentioned, like scarce resources and politics, is not just a matter of generational conflict, in the sense that, you have a bunch of old white American citizens who are afraid of, sharing their resources with, young people, their schools, their funding, and so forth, and that in the long run, it'll be solved. In the sense, these voters are dying off, right? So in the long run, of course, we're all dead, said John Maynard Keynes. So what do you do in the meantime, right, when the voters are, thinking that there's an invasion going on, and so border militarization is continuing, making, Hispanics the largest population, minority group. On the other hand, you have minorities living in large concentrated areas of the United States, in big cities, like think Ferguson, think Baltimore, who feel like they're under military occupation by white police officers who don't even live in their neighborhoods, who just come there to patrol the streets, right? And so what do you do in the meantime?
Thank you. Philippa.
Thanks so much to the panel, and this is just really very exciting. I wonder, in responding to Duncan's question about what kind of policy we should have, should it be the Canadian model or whatever, whether something that might be factored into the answer is not just looking at what it is that the United States wants from its citizens, but looking at the United States as a citizen. I mean, I'm sure we've all been shocked at the recent turning away of immigrant boats by Asian countries, because we felt there's something basically wrong about that. And we do have an asylum policy in the United States which seems to suggest that we have some kind of obligation to help rescue people from other countries, whether or not they would necessarily be the first choice of contributing citizens here. So the United States as a citizen in the international sector in the area of globalization. It seems to me that that ought to become part of the discussion because that might just have some impact on policymakers. I don't know how you would all react to that, but it just occurred to me as a result of watching all those boat people being turned back.
Thank you very much. I'd ask you for relatively concise responses to the questions. Answer whichever one you like. So down the line, Edward.
Your concerns are genuine concerns. They happen in local communities across the country. What was said about California earlier would be a model to look at. California was once the center of opposition in immigration back in the 80s and 90s. Today, it's the most receiving of countries because they've gotten used to immigrants and they've known how to go ahead and answer questions just like yours. But yes, the federal government needs to get more involved in just these kind of integration issues that Jonathan can speak more about. The generational conflict is very true. There have been whole books written about that. But what was said here about Social Security, whoever made some mention of it, is also very true that, in fact, immigrants, unskilled immigrants, contribute much. The Social Security system would already be in tremendous dire straits if it weren't for the immigrants we have here today.
Karthik.
So yeah, a couple of quick things. On this generational divide and more generally on immigration policy, you know, there's what an ideal policy should look like and what the politics of it turn out. And this is when I first started doing research. In fact, I presented this at the Wilson Center way back, even before I was a fellow here. I got some pushback. This was in the late 2000s by saying that the kind of restrictive efforts you're seeing it's largely a political explanation. There's not, you know, the sky is not falling. Things aren't going haywire and out of control. What's going haywire and out of control is our political dynamics. And so that, I think, offers both kind of hope. Hopefully you can change the politics of it, but also some of the constraints that you face. But the big thing is that leadership plays a critical role. So if we're talking about solving fundamental problems that we have, and we've seen that, even within parties, and especially the Republican Party, the kind of adults in the room keep trying to steer the conversation back towards ways that are strategically important, not only for localities and states, but even for the future of the Republican Party. The National Republican Party does not want to be where the California Republican Party is right now because of what they did on immigration. And I think we're going to start seeing that. In terms of the U.S. as a strategic citizen, I think it's I was in Australia last year. One of the projects I'm working on is comparing Asian migrants in Australia and in the U.S. And again, I mean, I'd much rather be the U.S. than Australia. Yeah, Australia has a vast ocean where it can turn people away, but it is not a global player. And I think that one of the things we should think about both nationally and even in places like Detroit and certain states, welcoming immigrants is a good thing. It's a sign of a vital economy and a vital country, the fact that people want to come and how best to harness that talent.
Thank you. Susan.
Yeah, I would totally agree about the politicization of the topic. And in response to your particular concerns, part of it obviously has to do with the politics, but also congressional deadlock specifically with regard to the issue of unaccompanied minors. And the way federal law works right now, when children are released from detention, even with the very small percentage of kids who get post-release services that would allow them to be better integrated into communities, to have the medical and mental health counseling that they need, the social services that they need, only 10% of that very large population I mentioned get those post-release services, and they only extend for 6 months. There's just been a study that was released yesterday about the need for much more individualized sort of service plans, but much more follow-up, and that's not going to happen as long as the Republicans and the Democrats cannot get together on comprehensive immigration reform and decide that they've got to at least vote on the fund and release the funds to make sure that this massive system that they have in place continues to operate.
Jonathan.
Thanks. I very much agree. It's a huge problem that the costs of absorbing people are basically dumped onto local governments, which leads to more friction than would otherwise would happen. On the long run, the demographic question, the challenge there is that voter turnout rates in the United States are directly correlated with age. So the older voters vote at higher rates, the youngest voters vote at the lowest rates, And so this idea of demography is destiny, when is Texas going to turn purple? Don't hold your breath.
Right.
It's going to be a really long time. And so in the meantime, an entire generation is dealing with substandard schools. They're not finishing high school, or if they are finishing, they're not getting much out of it and not moving forward. So an entire generation is, many of whom are second generation immigrant kids, are not getting public education, in part because of this lopsidedness in political representation. On the asylum issue, we have the challenge that the right to counsel, which is relatively recent for citizens, since the Gideon decision in the early 60s, does not apply in the immigration system nor in the asylum system. So, and the data shows there's a direct relationship between whether or not a child arrival has counsel and their likelihood of actually validating their asylum claim, not rocket science. That is a micro version of turning the boats back. It just doesn't happen on camera, right? So on the asylum issue for Mexico, I'm actually curious, Duncan, whether you saw any evidence that Central Americans who were fleeing violence and terror have any access at all to what on paper is Mexico's historically enlightened right to asylum. My impression is that nobody's heard of that upon arrival, and it's essentially not effective.
I think, Edward, yeah, please come in and I'll...
Can I add a conceptual thing to throw out on the rights of representation? Just other people may have opinions on this. I don't have a strong opinion on it. But the Supreme Court has never upheld right to representation for immigrants because the Supreme Court has always ruled that undocumented immigrants are protected. They have rights on anything that happens to them that's not immigration related, a workplace violation, whatever it may be. You've got a right. If it's immigration related, you are not a sovereign. You're not here legally, so you have no rights. And so at the moment you begin to give rights to people who have no rights here, you open up a whole Pandora's box of all other sorts of issues. And that's one reason why the courts have been hesitant to try to cross that line. I'm not trying to say that there's not a way to cross the line, but I am trying to say that there is a conceptual, constitutional, legal issue here, and every country faces the same issue.
But that same reasoning was used in the Dred Scott decision for slaves. The fact that it was decided by the Supreme Court does not mean that it could not be revisited.
But that's a much larger question of who has rights and the right to have rights.
Yes, but what you're saying is very true, but it's yes.
And just to answer your question, Jonathan, I mean, what we saw is that there's much more of a focus on trying to regularize, to gather data, to find out what's going on. We're at early stages in Mexico, I think, on this. There is the question of giving some kind of dignified treatment to immigrants, and that has been a lot of political pressure on that. And the follow-up to that is that's a huge step in the right direction. We're not there yet in terms of providing a much more humane approach overall, but the fact that we're actually recognizing in Mexico that there is a hypocrisy in our rhetoric. If we're claiming the United States doesn't treat immigrants well, and we're doing exactly that to Central Americans, finally there's been a recognition of that. And I think this is going to be an evolving issue over time. Now, of course, you have the other question, which is that you've got Central American immigrants and people from much further away in the detention center immigration station in southern Mexico. We saw people from all parts of the world. I mean, a number of Africans passing through there who had gone through Guatemala, El Salvador, and come up through Mexico and had been detained. They crossed the border into Mexico and are picked up within Mexican territory. And at that point, the question of whether they can claim refugee status is in doubt. And so it's a complicated situation down there. I actually was partly encouraged, though, because you are seeing a much more of a focus on the part of the Mexican government in issuing documents and trying to regularize flows and recognizing that their economy needs these people and that their society actually benefits from them. We have 3 more questions. Right there, thank you.
Hi, hello. My name is Mary Evelyn Porter. I want to thank this excellent panel for your work so far. Very quick Observation. I taught in the southernmost school in California on the border with Mexico for 25 years. 89% not first language English. And I had several wonderful successes. One young lady who graduated from UCSD, sorry, not Riverside, her father cut the
We
grass.
love the UC system.
Her father was the landscaper, one of the landscapers who cut the grass at the university. And she graduated and gave him her diploma. What I would like to ask, and this is for anybody, the example of California is an example for, as several people have now commented, for many countries. And some of the people on the panel in the earlier discussion, this is a problem for many countries throughout Europe, throughout North Africa, throughout Asia, Australia, immigration. The model that California is putting forward, that you don't necessarily have to have all the X's marked in the box in order to begin to get some of the benefits of being an immigrant, is profound, and not simply for the United States. What has been written so far on that in English, Spanish, Portuguese, any of those languages? I'm sure we have many people literate in several languages here in the audience.
Thank you. That's great. We have two questions here. The two gentlemen, yes. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Larry Harrington. I'm a former Wilson scholar, and I'm a former Deputy Attorney General in Tennessee. And this is from the out in the states perspective, a slight positive. Tennessee, the Tennessee legislature this year, the Republican Senate, overwhelmingly Republican Senate, voted to allow not just Dreamers but undocumented students, in-state students, to receive in-state tuition. It failed in the House by only a couple of votes and by only one vote, and there were, in that case, there were 2 Democrats who said they were for it who were somewhere else. So that was a very positive sign in a state that never went as far as Alabama or Arizona, but had its moments. So I think on the political debate, in the districts which are gerrymandered and where there's a lot of fear from the primary side by the Republicans, you are seeing some progress, partially caused in the Tennessee context because interestingly, and this is another data point, Western Kentucky University accepts at, I believe, an in-state rate, undocumented students from the region, certainly from Tennessee. So most of them just leave Tennessee and go up to Kentucky, and our legislators realized that we were losing a lot of good talent.
Very interesting, thank you. Let me just say that Larry Harrington is also one of our most active board members at the Mexico Institute, has supported us enormously over the years, so thank you for that. Gentleman in front of you.
Thank you. My name is Ruslan. I'm with the Canon Institute. Interesting questions actually you raised here, and I'm from Russia. And actually this is my 3rd time in America, and before I started with the Fulbright program, so I was a scholar twice before, but this time I'm an immigrant. So I won a green card through the lottery, and I brought my family with me. So in almost 1 year we are here with my family. So actually in Russia we left rather good positions. I'm an associate professor at university in Russia. My wife is a surgeon, doctor in Russia. So we just decided to come and to try new life. It's kind of to start from zero, actually. And we found it's very difficult. It's a very competitive country here. But if we fail, we can come back in any case to our country, I mean, and to continue our work there. But my question is about immigrations processes among Americans. I mean, do Americans immigrate? If yes, what countries do they prefer? What are the reasons for Americans to immigrate? And do they have strong connections being abroad? I mean, are there any strong communities that they support each other? Like here we found that Ethiopians, they support each other, Asians, they support each other, Russians, and so on and so on. So what about Americans? Thank you.
That's a great question.
That is a
And of
great
course, it
question.
brings to mind immediately Mexico, of course. Because, of course, you have well over 1 million Americans living in Mexico, and you have an unknown quantity more that are undocumented living in Mexico. and it raises some very, very interesting questions. The other day, I was in San Antonio, and the guy who drove me from the airport to my hotel, I was talking with him, and he said, "Oh, Mexico, yeah, it's a great country. I used to live there." Blah. He says, "But it's become too expensive now. So when I retire, I was looking at Costa Rica, but there's too many gringos there. So I'm actually looking at Honduras now." And he said, "I'm looking at Honduras because it's got some decent beaches, but most importantly, it has a good healthcare system." And I thought, this is part of the aging demographics of the United States. They're looking at opportunities around the world where you can live at a lower cost, and of course, healthcare is going to be a crucial part of that. So anyway, 3 great questions for our panel.
Do you want to take it?
I sort of lost track of the questions there. But I think that what's happening in Tennessee is really interesting, and it reflects 2 things. One, that historically, immigration has been supported by 2 groups, by the humanitarian left and by the business right. And in Tennessee, and they've been strange bedfellows, but this is not a Republican-Democrat issue, even though it is currently over immigration reform. But really in the country, it's a much deeper issue than that. And so in Tennessee, it's been really led very, very strong leadership in Nashville and in Tennessee on this issue, particularly by the business community, trying to make the most out of immigration and its commitment to the state, and it's been very successful at that. It's been a model for many others to follow. But immigration, generally speaking, has been in this country, the beauty of the United States is that it's an open system. You don't for immigrants, but it's really designed for the second generation to succeed, not the first. Whereas Europe, which is a much stronger social welfare system, gives you much more support to the first generation. But you can argue that you also become ghettoized and you don't move up as much and everything. You have much less opportunity.
Thank you. Karthik.
So UC San Diego was mentioned, and not only is it part of the UC system, but in fact it's a personal story here. So one of my first grad student placed out of UCR is a assistant, soon to be associate professor at UC San Diego, Tom Wong, and he was undocumented. Right? Asian American, undocumented, became legal through marriage, and is just a powerhouse now. I can claim a little bit of credit for all the work that he does. But that to me, we don't want to cherry pick the kinds of stories, but I think there are some, even from IRCA we've seen, right? All these people who were farm workers, but really their talents were elsewhere. And if you kind of liberate that, there's a lot that you can gain economically from that. So I think part of the challenge is to figure out, part of the things that you can't predict all these things. So are there other things you put into place so that even if not all the boxes are checked, you prevent kind of egregious abuse, but allow some of the dynamism of the economy to come forth? So I think that's important to think about. In terms of the current thing I'm working on is actually, like I told you, on this de facto state citizenship. We're calling it the California package. I don't know if there's some other, I'd love to hear some other thoughts on how to frame it and label it, but it is an alternative model. And I'd love to talk to you more about kind of what that looks like. Finally, in terms of Tennessee, Florida passed in-state tuition last year. I don't think it was related to Jeb putting his hat in the ring, but I think this is something that you'll see is a pendulum. We think of pendulums on policy having maybe decades-long swings, but the way the political system is set up, we have 2-year swings. If you remember, right after 2012, Reince Priebus had the Growth and Opportunity Project. Sean Hannity said, "I support amnesty." Right? That was 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And then with the midterm elections, the way that's structured is like, no way are you going to be pro-immigrant because then you get killed in the primaries. And that's why I said 2020 is potentially going to be the shift with the redistricting that happens. It's going to be a higher turnout year because it's a presidential election year. So maybe with the redistricting that happens after 2020, what looks like what the House will look like and also what happens in the states might make a difference. But right now, it's just amazing. We have a 2-year shuttling back and forth in terms of what our immigration policies should be.
Susan.
I would just like to mention the private universities. Beside the issue of the states that are granting in-state tuition to undocumented students. When I was at the Wilson Center, one of the things that I did was organized a special presentation of undocumented students at Georgetown, which is a private Catholic university, as I'm sure you know. And Georgetown, because, as you know, also federal funding is not available to undocumented students, they face enormous challenges. So Georgetown accepts them and gives them financial aid from the point of view of the university, and that's really an important benefit that a number of elite universities are doing. And so back to the human capital issue, though, that's something that, you know, sort of stands, it's both politicized and it's not spoken about in terms of the politics. When these kids were eligible for DACA, and during the 2012-13 year that I spent here, all of the kids who participated in that public presentation got DACA, and I have followed them now, they're graduating. They blossomed and were able to really take advantage of things like study abroad because they had the right to advance parole. They could have internships, they could work legally, et cetera. But when the second executive order was stayed by the judge in Texas, I've seen those same kids, you know, exhibit anxiety, be subject to depression, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, the formal institutional sort of things at the level of the state are very, very important, but we also have to go back and look at the politics that affect the DACA and DAPA.
Thank you, Susan. Before I give Jonathan the final word here, let me just recognize Andrew Seeley, Executive Vice President of the Wilson Center and former Director of the Mexico Institute, of course, you know, was coordinating, directing when Jonathan was working so hard on these immigrant community projects.
He's an undocumented immigrant in Mexico, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
I wasn't documented in Mexico. I was almost deported, but that's for another day.
There's a tradition of that here at the Wilson Center. We bring them from Mexico to run the Mexico Institute. Jonathan, please.
Thanks. You know, it's not a coincidence. It's in schools and higher education keep coming up because schools are the premier immigrant integration institution in the United States. And since 1982, the Supreme Court recognized that anyone in the U.S. has the right to public education, regardless of their immigration status. So that, you know, comes back to your point earlier. But why bother finishing high school if you can't get to higher education? And so that raises a whole series of issues of incentives. And in terms of one of the important ways in which California did help set a precedent was 2001, the state law allowing in-state tuition for anyone who finished California high school, which was a very important buffer because it means that people didn't have to expose themselves as undocumented. And in fact, not all these are called AB 540 students. It became a collective identity that was something of a shield, but people began to come out as AB 540 students, which was a precursor to what became the process of Dreamers as a collective identity, people coming out as Dreamers. And so it was in yet another way in which a trend in California became a national trend, leading to a movement that managed to work the system in the U.S. to convince the Obama presidency in full campaign in 2012. Let's remember why Obama made the concession for DACA. The students had, on the one hand, lobbied law professors and organized law professors to show why it was actually legal for this executive action to happen, and 100 law professors signed on, and so they had their insider track, and then they visited the Obama campaign offices in Colorado, one of the few swing states with a very significant Latino voter share, and began to occupy the campaign offices in a swing state and promised to do so until they got a response. So we had an insider-outsider strategy following our civics textbooks to persuade the Obama administration to acknowledge that it actually was within their power to change the lives of what has turned out to be many, many hundreds of thousands of people and their family with this new ambiguous semi-regularization that we have, which perhaps not coincidentally creates a massive stake in continuing to participate in the system for those whose right to be here could be taken away at any moment.
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan, thank you very much. We began this session with some reflections on Ellis Island from Edward. And you know, I'm just thinking, at what point do we change the poem underneath the Statue of Liberty? From give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Is that where we're heading? Is that something that we want to continue with? I've been fascinated to hear you guys talking about this, and it very much still is this focus on the human dimension of immigration rather than seeing this in entirely utilitarian terms. And I think that gives us an enormous amount of hope for the United States. I'm afraid that in my country, back in the UK, we're losing that. I've put something on the table and we don't have time to discuss it. Sure. So we're going to have to go and get lunch right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention today.